Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I'm very pleased to welcome Tim Weiss to Google today. Tim is an American anti-racism activist and writer. He's the author of 6 books, including the highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. His next book, The Culture of Cruelty, How America's Elite Demonized the Poor, Valorized the Rich, and Jeopardized the Future, will be released in winter 2014. Please join me in welcoming him to talk to us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I'm particularly grateful that you're here because even though I've done this for a very long time and now about 24 years of doing anti-racism work of some sort or civil rights work of some sort, and about 18 of those on the road speaking to folks around the country, you never really know when somebody asks you to come in and talk, whether it's at a company or whether it's at a college or a high school or occasionally a middle school or community group, wherever it is I go, who's going to show up, how many people are going to show up, how much interest there is in the conversation. One of the reasons in particular you don't know that nowadays, maybe even more so than when I began this work so long ago, is that in just about every sense, all the other voices in the culture, at least the majority of them, if not all, seem to be telling you in a lot of different ways that this kind of conversation really isn't necessary, that we really don't have to have this talk, that we don't have to address issues of race or racial equity in the workplace or in the school system or the justice system or the housing market or anywhere else, because to hear those voices tell it, and again, you'll hear this echoed through the media, you'll hear this echoed through the words of politicians and talking heads all around the country. We're living in this, presumably, in their mind, sort of post-racial era, where these conversations, though they were, very important a while back, they're now like so 1965 or something, or maybe even 1995 if we're being generous. But now, or maybe even 2007 if we're being really generous, right? But now that we're in this post-racial era, symbolized, of course, first and foremost by the election not once but twice of a man of color as president, you don't have to have this conversation. I don't need to give it. You don't need to hear it. In fact, I remember immediately after President Obama was elected the first time, I opened my email the next day. I knew there'd be all kinds of wonderful, lovely things that people would have to say to me. And one of them was especially, pertinent to this conversation. It was all capital letters, so you're dealing with crazy when it's all capital letters, and they're screaming at you as if I wouldn't have known they were pissed if they had taken the cap lock off. And the email was something to the effect of saying, well, now you're going to have to find a new hustle, right? Because that's clearly what fighting racism is. It's just a big hustle to make a lot of money and get very famous, because that is exactly what you would do if you were sitting in a dorm room at the age of 19 thinking to yourself, what the hell would I do if I wanted to get really rich and really famous? Oh, I would fight white supremacy, because that always works out well. So anyway, it said you should get a new hustle, because now that Barack Obama has been elected, clearly we don't have to have this conversation anymore. Racism is dead, and you're going to have to find some other line of work. Now, if that were only one voice in an angry email saying that, and the day after an election, then maybe I wouldn't have taken it very seriously, just like I don't take most of the emails that I receive all that seriously. But unfortunately, that mantra was repeated, usually in a lot more erudite way than that, without the capital letters, without the electronic or real screaming, but by people oftentimes very well intended and quite sincere in their belief that we're living in this sort of post-racial era where this conversation is not important. Of course, if we just think about it for maybe 2 seconds, we can recognize, I hope, almost immediately why the notion of post-raciality is absurd, at least if the only evidence you have for it is the election of a black man as president of the United States. I mean, if you have other evidence, feel free to present it. But if that's the sum total of your evidence, if that's exhibit 1 and 2 and 3 through 7, then you're probably not on very firm ground, any more so than we would have been on firm ground if someone were to have said, let's say in Pakistan in 1989, the year after Benazir Bhutto, a woman was first elected president of that country, that sexism was no longer an issue in Pakistan, right? Patriarchy has been smashed, and this we know because a woman is the head of state in Pakistan, or when Margaret Thatcher was elected in Great Britain, or when Indira Gandhi was elected in India, or Golda Meir in Israel, or Corazon Aquino in the Philippines. So in all of these countries, you can probably think of others, there have been female heads of state. We still haven't had one. So if I were to suggest, for instance, to my 2 daughters who are 12 and 10, that what they probably really ought to do if they want equal opportunity as women is pack up their bags and move to Karachi right? My guess is that even the 10-year-old who has no idea where the hell Karachi is would know that the odds were that wasn't a good bet. Just because a woman had been the head of state in Pakistan did not mean that other women were going to therefore have equal opportunity. So we wouldn't make the argument about sexism in those countries just because they've had female heads of state. And I would hope that we would be able to see through the argument about race as it relates to this country. But it's very easy to get sucked into that rhetoric of post-raciality, and I think maybe it's more than ever possible in a place like Silicon Valley, where more so than just about any other sort of industrial area of America, both geographically and historically, there is this very widely accepted mythology that this, more so than any other part of the American economy and any other part of the geography of the country, is this pure meritocracy, right? All those other industries, no, they're not really meritocratic. We know that there are networks and there's clubbiness and there's cultures that get in, sort of reestablished and resurrected and passed on, but not here. There's no such thing as clubbiness or insider advantages or networks or even a criteria that might itself not be all that meritocratic in Silicon Valley. Well, the smirks on some of your faces at least suggest to me that you've thought through this a minute and realized that some of that rhetoric is quite well sold, but quite a bit overblown. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we do have to ask ourselves one very simple question when people tell us that this industry or that this country or the overall economy or this particular company is meritocratic. It then begs the question, right? That if in fact this company and the larger part of the economy that it represents and of which it is a part is truly meritocratic, then you would have to really ask yourself some hard questions about what that means in terms of who possesses merit in this country and who doesn't. Because if you have an entire area, both of the economy and a geographic region, this being the Silicon Valley, where only about 6% of all the employees in the various firms and companies here are Black and Latino, and you believe at the same time that this is a pure meritocracy as a part of the economy, then you would have to actually come to some very racist conclusions. Almost by definition, right? You would have to conclude that only 6% of the best people are represented by African American and Latino folk who collectively in the country, represent approximately 30% of the population, and in this state, quite a bit more than that. You would have to assume that there was this real dearth of ability, this real dearth of merit, this real dearth of interest in having jobs in the growing part of the economy, as if somehow Black and brown folks would prefer to stay embedded in parts of the economy that are rapidly dying and leave all the really great jobs disproportionately to those who were white, and of course on a gender level and sex level, those who were male. You would also have to assume some very sexist things. If you really buy into the notion of Silicon Valley as a pure meritocracy, you would have to assume that men are just that much damn smarter, right? And just that much better at doing certain types of jobs. Now, there may or may not be evidence for that, and you may believe there is, but certainly not to the extent we see the disproportionalities in not only this sector of the economy, but in old sectors of the economy like manufacturing, where the same kind of thing was true. Is it really true that women were only 1%, 1.5%, 2% of the people qualified for jobs in the old quote-unquote economy in certain companies, firms, or industries? Well, probably not. But if you're going to accept that premise, understand where it leads you as we try to have these conversations. If you're going to assume that Silicon Valley or that Google itself as an entity is a pure meritocracy, you would have to assume not only some very racist and sexist things about certain folks, which would then, it seems to me, have an impact on how you perceive even your coworkers who are women or who are people of color, right? Because if I actually look at people and think they're part of a culture or group of people that are on general not as good, that are in general not as qualified, how do I really relate to the 1 or 2 that I actually work with? Or the 5 or 6 that I see on a regular basis? How do I subdivide my brain into the part that says, oh no, this person's just as good as anybody else, but the group they're from is really screwed up? Like, is that actually something the human brain is capable of doing? Saying on the one hand that I believe this group to be superior to this group to be harder working, this group to be more innovative, this group to be, better for this particular kind of job, but there are a handful of y'all that are okay, and I'll be able to keep that in mind as I work with you on a daily basis. The psychological research says that's not likely. So in fact, if we buy into those stereotypes, we're likely to perpetuate the very culture that maintains those inequalities, even if we don't necessarily intend to do it. So how would we know if we were a meritocracy? How would we know if racism were operating in a company or in an industry? How would we know if sexism were? Well, those seem like obvious questions, but they don't really have obvious answers, because when you ask them, how would you know if racism was operating? You ask 100 people that, You're going to have a lot of different answers. One thing we know from history is that if you're really wanting to figure out if racism is operating, the first thing you don't want to do, as a general rule with some exceptions, is ask white people. Right? Just being perfectly honest. Just like if you want to know if sexism is operating, you wouldn't start by asking men. Right? Just wouldn't make sense. If you wanted to know if an industry or a company were, discriminatory toward those with disabilities, right, on the basis of ableism, you wouldn't ask the able-bodied, because when you're a member of a dominant group, whatever that is, whether it's race, gender, sex, class, sexuality, religion, educational background, whatever it might be, right? Those individuals who are members of dominant groups, and we're all, in just about every case, members of at least one or two. Everyone I see in this room is probably got a mix of identities, some of which make you a dominant group in certain categories, others of which make you a subordinate or potentially targeted group for mistreatment and discrimination on the other. When you're dominant, why would you be expected to know what other people who are not experience? It would be sort of irrational, wouldn't it, for me as a man to actually have a keen insight into what women experience in terms of sexism. Now, I might know. And if I do, it's probably because I listened to a woman describe her reality and decided to assume she was actually sane and not overwrought, not over-emotional, not hormonal, because apparently a lot of guys think only women have hormones, which is fascinating. Testosterone does nothing to us. Estrogen is a killer. It'll totally jack you up. Men would not be the ones to whom you would from whom you would seek information and insight about sexism. Not because they can't know, but the odds are that's not going to be your best bet. Same thing with race and asking white folks, or going to white folks and asking them, do you think there's racism in Silicon Valley? Well, it seems to me make more sense to start by asking people of color about their own experiences. And they're not all going to have the same opinion on that, by the way. They're not all going to have the very same experiences. But in general, it's probably a safe bet to say that if we want to know if a problem exists, the people to whom you would first turn are the people who are most likely to have to know the answer to that question as a matter of daily survival. If I want to know if racial profiling happens in New York, I don't ask people on Wall Street. Right? Because even though they might need to be racially profiled based on their own past criminal endeavors and activities that have helped to tank the economy in the last 6 years, we know they're not going to be. And if they spend their entire time in Battery Park and they spend their entire time on Wall Street going to really nice restaurants where the NYPD never bothers them, and you ask them if that's happening, they're probably not going to see it. And here's the thing. They're not going to see it even if they're good people. And in fact, I'll go so far as to say they're not going to see it precisely because they're such good people in many cases, and I mean that seriously. Like most people, I think, are good. Most folks don't want to oppress others. Most men don't actually wake up in the morning seeking to marginalize women, but we manage to do it, even though we didn't wake up with that goal. White folks don't wake up with the goal of sort of reinscribing white supremacy every single day and subordinating people of color, but the evidence says we managed to pull that off, even if it wasn't our intention. Why? Because when you're a good person, when you have all the right sort of ideas and ideologies and ways of thinking, and you think you're very open-minded, it's oftentimes that precise person who's the most dangerous, because it's that person who doesn't want to look at the ugly, right? And by that I mean who doesn't want to look at the injustice that might be in their community, whether it's at a company or whether it's at a school or whether it's in a neighborhood or whether it's some private club to which you belong. Because if you're a good, caring, compassionate person, you look at the ugly and then you realize you're on the hook. You actually have to do something about that. Because you're a good person, now you feel like crap. If you were a sociopath, this wouldn't be a problem, right? And the good news is, and there is some, we're mostly not sociopaths. So make sure to write that down, tweet that, whatever you need to do. It's like, we're not mostly sociopathic, but because we're not sociopathic, we look at the pain of racism or sexism or classism or homophobia and heterosexism, and for people who really are compassionate, we turn away from it almost as quickly as we turn towards it, because to be reminded of it and to be reminded that we're sort of in the midst of that is to put us on the hook. And we really don't like to be on the hook because there's only 24 hours in a day, 7 days a week, 365 in most years. And so as a result, we just don't have extra time to deal with all the problems that we have. And so we turn away from it. So I think the first lesson when we have these conversations is, as glad as I am to be here and as honored as I am to be here, and I'm very happy to be able to be to speak to you and to other folks around the country, if we're really going to get to a place where we know we've created racial equity in a company or in a community, or gender equity in a company or community, or sexual equity in a company or community, it's really important that we get to a place where we can hear all the stuff that I'm saying, and I'm going to continue to say for a few more minutes, from the people who are the targets. It's fine for me as a straight white male to stand up and talk about this stuff, and upper middle class with a college degree and able-bodied, and here I embody all of these privileged groups. But until we're able to also hear women say it without getting defensive as men, and getting pissed, right? Until we're prepared to hear people of color say it without, as white folks, getting pissed. Until we're prepared to hear LGBT folks say it without those of us who are straight or cisgendered or gender normative getting angry, and upset and pissed off, then until that happens, we're really not in a place of equity. Part of the problem, I think, when we have the conversation is that we usually are coming from very different places in terms of how we're defining the concepts that we're discussing. So if you hear that there's going to be a conversation, it's about racism, you automatically have certain assumptions about what we're going to discuss and what that means. And naturally, as good people, we don't want to think that we're implicated in racism. My God, if there's racism in my company, then that means that's on me. But we're thinking of racism in a very sort of traditional way when we use that term. And that's what gets us in trouble. That's what, if we had heart monitors on people, when you said, oh, we're going to have a talk about racism, right? If you had heart monitors, you'd see the blood pressure spike. That's what the research, people get very nervous when they think we're going to talk about this. And the reason is they think they're going to be called a racist, right? And that if they are somehow called a racist, that we mean like they're like got their Klan robes in the closet and they brought them in on the bus or the bike or however the hell they got to work today, and they're going to the neo-Nazi rally and they, are actually skinheads in disguise. And people make those assumptions. And so as a result, they get very defensive. Nobody wants to be thought of as that. If we had a different understanding, though, if we had an understanding that racism is not principally that when we're talking about racism in the modern era, it's not that that stuff isn't still there, it is, right? And those of us who do this work long enough, we get death threats from folks like that. They still are around, they don't actually ever go anywhere. You call them neo-Nazis, but really there's nothing neo or new about what they do. It's sort of Paleolithic or Jurassic Nazis. They're decidedly old school, but they're still around. But that's not really the issue, and it's certainly not the issue I assume that I need to address in a corporate setting. If it is, like, I'm screwed, I need to get the hell out of here, and we're all wasting our time. If we're actually in a place where there's such overt hostility and bigotry of the nature of hate group activity, then nothing that I can say in 45 minutes or that anyone could say is going to solve that problem. But if we understood that racism is much more nuanced than that, particularly in the modern era, it might have always been more nuanced, but it certainly is now, then we can have a much better talk without the same levels of defensiveness. So when I use the term racism and I talk about racism as a problem, I am not presuming in this or any other company to which I speak or at any school where I speak or community that we are mostly talking about malicious individuals who are deliberately seeking to harm others. Though I know they're there, that's not what I'm talking about and that's not what I'm focused on. Likewise, you don't necessarily have to assume a direct intentional victim or target. So neither the perpetrator of racism nor the victim of racism has to necessarily do anything consciously to make the injury take place or to get in the way of the injury. In fact, sometimes we talk about racism, we're not really talking about it in the overt one-on-one, I don't like you, therefore I mistreat you kind of way. We're talking about it in a much more systemic sense. And just like any ism that you can think of just about is both an ideology and a system, the same is true with racism. Think about that, right? Capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarianism, what are these? They're ideologies. They're also ways of organizing a society. They're also systems, right? And you can sometimes be in that system even if you don't accept the ideology, right? You can be in that system and by virtue of your actions perpetuate that system even if you don't buy the ideology. Materialism is a good example of this. Materialism we understand, like if I go to the store and I engage in some impulse purchase, right? We understand what I mean, maybe in the moment I don't understand what I'm doing, but later on I think about it, I'm like, why did I buy the candy bar? I didn't want chocolate, I didn't go to the and I didn't go for the People magazine. What the hell is wrong with me? But I picked up the People magazine, I picked up the candy bar because why? Well, because the marketers put it there. The people who actually stage the stores put it there knowing that someone's going to buy that and be part of this larger system of consumption and materialism, right, of consumerism. They could have put the chocolate on the chocolate aisle, right, but that wouldn't, I mean, they could have. There's a candy aisle in every grocery, but they didn't put all the chocolate there, and it's not like they just had some left at the end and were like, I don't know, what the hell do we do with this? Oh, I don't know, just put it up near the place where they pay, like that was some kind of coincidence. Right? It was very deliberate, knowing that even though your mentality, you didn't wake up and go, I am a materialistic consumerist hack. I can't wait to go buy crap I don't need today. Like nobody does that, but you fall into it. And therefore, that's why they continue to keep the candy there. If everybody sort of made a conscious choice not to do that, they might rethink. But they know that we can fall into those cognitive traps when they're trying to sell us stuff. That's why companies spend billions of dollars, including this one, to market stuff. Like you think, Google spends, I don't know how much, I know it's a lot, right? to market stuff. And it works. If it didn't work, you'd get new PR people. You'd change your whole approach and your whole strategy. People spend money to convince people they need this, they need to think this, they need to act like this, dress like this, be like this, own this piece of technology, own this vehicle, live in this neighborhood, because it works. And if you can be convinced of the kind of computer that you need to have, or if you can be convinced of the kind of smartphone that you need to have, or if you can be convinced of the kind of toilet paper that you need to use so as not to chafe, right? Because, oh God, no, Downy, that'll never work, or, Angel Soft, no, I need Charmin, Charmin knows if they spend enough dough that you'll maybe fall into that. To the extent that they can sell us products, commercial products with advertising, how much easier is it, you think, to internalize over the course of a lifetime, right, all of the commercials, if you will, that we've been given about race and racial others, all of the commercials that we've been given and exposed to about gendered and sexual and religious and class others, right? Because we've been seeing that commercial since we were children, so to speak, right? Over and over again. And people who are marketers will tell you, and people that are in marketing and advertising will tell you, it only takes about 12 commercials for a particular consumer product before all of a sudden you begin to see brand loyalty and you begin to see an uptick in sales. The law of 12. Some people call it the law of 11 if they're really good. They can do it in 11. But usually it takes a dozen commercials. And after a dozen, it's like, damn, I need that product, right? And so ultimately, I guarantee we've certainly been exposed to racial stereotypes more than 12 times. We've been exposed to gender and class and sexual and religious stereotypes more than 12 times, some of it since we were very, very young. And so the odds that somehow that hasn't stuck to us, or that it stuck to all those other people out there, but not here, not at this company, not in this valley, not in this industry, incredibly unlikely, not a very parsimonious expectation. I would suggest that it's probably the case that there's not such rarefied air. I mean, I'm breathing it. It seems clean in here. You all filter your air very well, from what I can tell. But as opposed to the salt flats as we were coming in, which were not nearly as nice. But ultimately, the idea that the rarefied air here is so different that those things that beset the mere mortals in the outside world wouldn't happen here. Pretty incredibly unlikely. So if we can let go of our concern about bigotry being the issue, if we can let go our sense that to be accused of racism is to be accused of being a bad person, or to be accused of perpetrating sexism is to be accused of a bad person, then if we can let go of that, we can have a real meaningful conversation. What are the ways you think that we can perpetuate, if you will, racism, sexism, other isms, even without intentionality? Because that's the stuff that, unless we think very consciously about it, we'll make mistakes and not even realize that we've done it. The obvious stuff, the answer is just stop doing it. But the stuff that's so subconscious you don't realize you're doing it, or that's a matter of systemic practice and you never reflect on it, is the stuff that goes under the radar. So what are the ways that that can happen with racism, with sexism, or any other ism? I would suggest there are three ways with regard to race. One is this notion, this real myth of objectivity. And now I mean this on a personal level. This idea that we're actually capable of objectively evaluating the merit of another human being. I know we like to believe that we're capable of this. We really do. You'll hear people say it all the time. Well, it's not racism. We just hire the most qualified person. As if somehow there are 310 million Americans and it is capable to rank them from 1 to 310 million and then say, well, you were 167,412. You've got the job, right? Or you were 2,307,000. Sorry, you don't quite make the cut. Or you were 11. Hot damn. We have found the 11th most wonderful human being on the planet for this gig. That isn't rational, but we act as if somehow we can just take people's resumes, take their background, sit them down in an interview for a few minutes, and then we can be these sort of perfect, receptors of information, whether it's their background or the answers they give us to the questions that we ask, and that we can just filter it out like a computer with no biases whatsoever. And we believe this in part because we want to. It's a lot nicer than to think that we're incredibly flawed and incapable of really being objective. But what the evidence very clearly tells us is that we're not nearly as capable of it as we'd like to believe. So that when we think about jobs and hiring and promotions and evaluation of existing employees, in just about any company, this would be true. At any college, in the admissions office, this would be true. At any graduate school, business school, med school, law school, same thing. The notions that often affect who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets admitted, what the evaluation of the employee is, are affected by, those things are affected by the notion of fit, who does and does not, right? The notion of qualifications, by which we really are talking about formal credentials, not necessarily qualifications, because qualifications can be quite intangible. Credentials are very clear and they're on paper. And some of them are probably quite important, others maybe not so objective, right? But we certainly utilize them. And those are really the two things. There's not three, just fit and credentials. And yet what the research tells us is that the notion of fit is incredibly subjective, more so than just about any other concept perhaps in the workforce, especially in an industrial culture, in an economic culture that is its own sort of universe, right? Which is true of tech, but it's also true of heavy manufacturing in the past. They created cultures, did they not? And the people that were seen as fitting in with that culture, they didn't all look the same. They didn't all have the same story. They didn't all have the same education or background or accent or, religion, but there was a certain continuity. Right? Even with the diversity that existed just in people's lives and family backgrounds, there was still a lot of similarity. There were certain expectations about affect, about dress, about style, about your hobbies, about the things that you would do. And if those things affected who did and didn't get hired, who did and didn't get promoted in the auto industry, for instance, or if it affected who did and didn't get promoted, who didn't get the gig in, forget manufacturing, think about police departments or fire departments, right? Where no doubt the people who were getting hired for most of those jobs were probably qualified for them in some sense. I mean, the fire department was not generally picking people who were incapable of fighting fires, but the idea that they were actually capable of figuring out who were the 20 best firefighting human beings in this community, pretty unlikely. There was all this other intangible stuff happening, and the research tells us that the notion of fit is directly affected and impacted by racial bias, gender bias, class bias, sexual bias, all of those, and a lot of other types too, right? And that we tend to see merit more quickly in someone that reminds us of ourselves, whether that's in terms of our background or in terms of our interest or in terms, it could be something as intangible as the music that you like or, all kinds of things. Do you do CrossFit or something? It could be anything, God forbid, right? It could be that. But the point being that this notion of fit isn't really about objective evaluation, and to the extent that it can be affected by racial bias, gender bias, class bias, all these things that the research tells us we internalize from the time that we're very young, then even when we think we're being purely objective and fair-minded in the hiring process, the evaluation process, the promotion process, we're not really able to do that. The second principal way in which we can maintain racial bias, and this would be true for other biases, is that there's also this myth of institutional objectivity. So it's not just that our personal biases, many of which are subconscious according to the research, get in the way of how we actually evaluate people. That's part of it. But this other part, which is even more frightening, is even if we were capable of being perfect evaluators of other people's merit, the problem is the criteria we're using to determine merit may itself be flawed, may not be as objective as we think. So even if we were objective, the criteria might not be. What do I mean by that? Well, you think about maybe the most meritocratic merit indicator that there is. What would it be? If you're hiring, you would think, well, it seems like the best indicator is experience, right? That seems fair, that seems objective, that seems like a pretty good merit indicator. But the problem is, when we determine whether someone does or does not have as much experience as makes them qualified, we oftentimes set incredibly arbitrary limits on that, or frames around that, or a particular definition of what experience is that is not really objectively arrived at. I've worked with companies that I always make the habit, usually, I didn't do it this time, but I usually make the habit of going and looking at the last 10 job postings that I can find for a particular gig, right? Just to see what they're asking for, right? And you go and it'll say 5 to 6 years, 4 to 7 years, 8 to 10 years, 2 to 3 years. And I'll go and I'll ask the folks I'm working with, okay, where'd you get that number? Why 4 to 6? Why not 3 years, 4 months, 2 weeks, and an afternoon? Why? What was the actual objective, other than just picking a nice round number, right? What evidence do you have that 4 to 6 is really what's necessary? And that if you only had 3.5, you'd be screwed for another half a year. No, you have to wait 6 more months and then come back and it'll be fine. And every time I've asked that question, why this criteria as opposed to that one, without exception, there's never been an objective evaluation. There's never been what's called a reliability analysis in this work done to determine that this is really necessary, and without this, you're likely to fail at this job. Usually it's because that's what the last guy, and it usually is a guy, had to have, right? So that's what, by God, that's what I had to have. And if I had to jump through those hoops, you're going to jump through those hoops. That's what's called a positional good. Right? It's something that I have, you want it, and I'm going to make damn sure that you have to go through all the same troubles that I did in order to get it. Now, the positional good may be valuable as a criteria, or it may be really strange. So, for instance, most of the time college professors have to have a PhD, certainly to be tenured, right, in most institutions. And that might make sense, but then you have to actually ask yourself, well, what makes a person get a PhD? What do you do to get a PhD? Because it seems objective, it seems fair. It's the highest level you can get in most fields, right? But unless you get a JD or something, some other type of specialized professional degree. But is it really objective? Well, let's think about it. How do you get a PhD? You get a PhD usually writing a dissertation, which is that you write a really long paper, right, on a very narrow subject. It's not like you're doing a survey of your entire subject matter. You're picking a really narrow, finite area. So Newt Gingrich, for example, has a PhD. Now, I could end the joke right there in some regards, I suppose. But he has one. He has one actually from my alma mater, which I'm not overwhelmingly happy about, but it is what it is. And he has this PhD in history. He got this PhD in history because he wrote a dissertation. Fantastic, that's what you do. And because he has a PhD, if Newt Gingrich wanted to be a history professor at any college in this country, he probably also could do that because he was a Speaker of the House, so that probably would help. But even if he hadn't done that, right, just the PhD would probably qualify him in the eyes of most for being hired. And yet, what was his PhD in? Well, it's history, but how did he get it? He wrote a dissertation. What was it about? It was about Belgian educational policy in the Congo. Fascinating, right? And I suppose if you're an historian of the Belgian Congo, that is a very important subject. And if you were going to teach a class on Belgian educational policy in the Congo, I don't have any doubt Newt Gingrich is probably your guy. And that's actually arguable because when he did his PhD in Belgian educational policy in the Congo, he didn't actually interview any black folks from the Congo. He just interviewed people in Belgium. So even then, you might say he's not really that much of an expert, but we'll just cut him slack for the sake of argument because I'm feeling generous, and we'll say that if you were going to teach a class on that subject, he probably knows more about it than a lot of people. But does that mean that he's more qualified to teach like a U.S. history 1865 to the present survey class? Not necessarily. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. So even a really seemingly objective criteria like that can get us in trouble unless we dig deeper. And the same is true with credentials generally for one very simple reason. How we get them isn't just about a fair race in which everyone has started at the very same point and has the finish line in front of them, and then whoever's the fastest runner gets there. We're talking about a larger system of job networking and job opportunities in which some people have had 3-lap head starts in an 8-lap race, or 5-lap head starts, or even just a half a lap head start, right? If I've had even a little bit of a head start on you and we're running a race, I'm supposed to cross the finish line first. That's sort of how that works, right? And in fact, if I have a head start on you and I don't cross the finish line first, there's something wrong with me, right? I'm not as fast a runner. If I have a 5-lap head start in an 8-lap race and when the race is over, I'm only ahead by 3, I still won, right? But you're the faster runner. So if you were trying to pick people for a track team, you would want the person who made up ground, right, and close the gap in terms of achievement rather than the person who just hit the tape first. When we talk about jobs, it's not quite like a race, but it's not altogether different either, because none of us are sort of just starting from scratch, unless it's your very first job, and even then you're not starting from scratch because you went to school somewhere, and even that wasn't scratch because you had a family and they had a certain set of opportunities or lack thereof. So in a sense, we're constantly inheriting these 8-lap relay races. But we're not inheriting the starting line at the very same point. And so if we're going to evaluate who's the most qualified and we're looking only at the tape at the end of the race, which is what the resume in a sense represents. The resume, the job references, the application that you fill out, that's the end result of whatever you've done before, which is great. Just like the 8th lap and the tape is the end result of the race. But unless I know all the stuff that happened in lap 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, or at least some of the stuff, I'm not going to maybe know all of it, but if I don't know any of it, am I really likely to make a really excellent, objective, fair decision at the end about who the most qualified person is? Well, I might get lucky, but I could also be horribly wrong if what I'm seeing is just the detritus of an opportunity structure that's unequal, which is to say that both ethically and practically we need to rethink the notion of merit. Ethically, of course, because that means a lot of people who might be the best are being left by the side, not because they're any less capable, but just because maybe they don't know the right people, they haven't been in the pipeline as long, so they don't have the same credentials, right? But also because it hurts institutional integrity, right? If a company's trying to actually find the best people, which I think makes sense, as long as we have an expansive, capacious understanding of what the best people means, then they would want, I would think, to have a criteria that was less likely to produce outcome-based decisions that were the end of the 8th lap, the tape at the end of the race, that they would want to have as expansive a notion of merit as possible and as holistic a way of assessing merit so as to get the best people, not only to be fair, that's part of it, but also to make sure that they actually do in fact get the best people for the job. The final problem that perpetuates injustice that corporate folks need to think about, educators need to think about, and all of us really in the country need to think about, is what I would suggest as colorblind formalism would be sort of the term that I guess I would use. And what I mean by colorblind formalism is this very formal, very formulaic way in which we just don't talk about race, and we don't think about race, or we act as if we don't see it. So when we talk about racism, that's what people will say as their first line of defense. Well, I don't even see color. I don't think about color. Well, that's maybe the problem. If you don't think about color in a world in which color matters, then you're going to miss an awful lot of stuff. Right? It'd be like saying, well, I'm ability blind. I don't notice disability. Now think about that. Like if you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1991. And if anyone said, well, our goal is to be disability blind, well, then how the hell are you going to build a ramp if you're not, like, you're not going to build a ramp for folks in chairs because I'm not noticing this. I didn't even see you were in a chair. Ergonomic workplaces, what the hell? I don't know anything about that. You need a certain width in the door. I don't know. You know, why would I do that? You know, elevators? I'm not noticing that you're disabled. You know, all the different things that come with disability. If I'm not noticing them, the odds are I'm not going to take the kind of steps that I need to ensure that you actually have equity of opportunity and treatment. And then I'm going to pretend that I've been really innocent and kind and nice. Like, oh, but I didn't even see you. Yes, exactly. And that's why you didn't make the workspace more functional for me and others like me. The same is true with race or gender or sexuality or anything else. If you're going to create real equal opportunity, you have to take a not colorblind or gender blind or sex blind or sexuality blind or any blind approach. You have to take a very color conscious, gender conscious, sex conscious approach that actually looks at the way that these dynamics oftentimes skew our own judgments and skew the very criteria that we are using. To be blind to color, as Julian Bond, civil rights legend, puts it, is to be blind to the consequences of color. And so if the consequences of color are still quite real, being colorblind means we take a very passive approach. We just take it as they come. Lots of times folks will say, we'll hire whoever walks through the door is most qualified. The problem being, if certain people know the location of that door and they know which way the door turns and they know the combination code to get through that door, right, then they're going to have a much easier time. Or if somebody just simply thinks that behind the door will lie rejection, right? So imagine, you know, if you're a member, and like I said, all of us in here are at some point probably members of dominant groups and also members of subordinate groups. I've rarely met anyone who was only a dominant group, that every one of their identities was dominant, and I've never met anyone whose every identity was non-dominant. Could happen, but it's rare, right? So when you're a member of a dominant group, if you think about being anything but that, what it would be like to go to a place where you were so incredibly underrepresented. And you're making assumptions in your own head about why that might be. You're assuming, well, maybe it's overt racism, sexism, classism, et cetera, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's just subtle bias, or maybe it's just the culture of this institution is going to be off-putting and they don't really think that I fit. So if they don't think I fit, I'm not even going to try. Right? Which gets to the heart of the problem sometimes in Silicon Valley, where people will say, well, you know, there's just not enough qualified, you know, fill in the blank, right? Not enough qualified women in this kind of work, not enough qualified people of color in this kind of work. That's oftentimes a dodge and oftentimes inaccurate, statistically speaking. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say for the hell of it, that even if it's true, what does it mean? Let's just say for the sake of argument that there really aren't enough to dramatically change the demographics of Silicon Valley, at least not right away. What then obligations do we have to do something about it? Do we just passively go, oh well, you know, it's not my fault. I didn't create that imbalance. It sort of sucks. I wish it wasn't like that, but I don't really have time to think about that. Or do we think, well, wait a minute. Now, we inherit this legacy for which we're not to blame, but we've inherited it, and we sort of have to be accountable to and responsible for what we do with that. That's what we do as responsible people. I don't think any of us in here are deliberately responsible, I hope not, for poisoning the water and the air and the soil all around this planet. And you didn't actually take your own bucket of hazardous waste and go inject it in a deep well into the water outside in the back of your house. But it got in there. You didn't go and belch smoke with toxic chemicals into the air, but somebody did that, and now you inherit the legacy. And as a responsible person, not just as a citizen of a country, but a citizen of the planet, you have an obligation to deal with the stuff that gets handed to you. So if we know that unfairness and inequity has been handed down to us, then we have to be conscious about how we're going to undo that. You can't do that passively. And ultimately, if you try, you create incredible dysfunctions. It's not a sustainable model, ultimately, to be formally colorblind, to not think about race, to not think about issues of inequity, or to not challenge our own subjectivities, whether they're personal or institutional. Because here we are in a state that's already mostly people of color, in a country that's going to be roughly 50-50 white and people of color within a mere 30, maybe 35 years at the most, maybe as few as 25. So somewhere between 25 and 35 years from now, we're going to be a half and half country of white folks and people of color, unless you actually think, and unless folks throughout America and in Silicon Valley in particular think that it is possible to maintain a tech sector on the back of a dwindling percentage of the population, right? Which is incredibly unlikely, and it's a pretty risky gamble, I would think, unless we actually believe that we'll just continue to be able to cull 80, 85, in some cases even 90% of the best talent from a group of people that's shrinking in terms of its size, right? Then we better think very seriously about how we're not going to just passively sit back and say, oh, well, we wish there were more of them, but there aren't, but we're actually going to go out and have to create that pool. We're going to have to actually go out and seed that pool, whether that means collaborating with school districts and individual schools and mentoring folks at a very young age when they're actually thinking about what they want to be and what they want to do when they grow up. Right? I remember doing that when I was in 3rd or 4th or 5th grade. A lot of people don't think about it until quite a bit later, but if I never know that you exist or that your opportunities exist or what it would even mean to work here, what it would even mean to work in Silicon Valley generally at any institution, then the odds are pretty good. It's just not going to be on my radar. If it's not on my radar, I'm not likely to apply for a job or seek a career in the industry. And if I don't apply, then I can't be actively discriminated against, in which case I can't sue and nothing ever changes. I mean, I can't sue if you don't actually mistreat me, and you can't even mistreat me if I don't even know you exist or know how to reach you. So we have to do that level of very deliberate seed planting in order to create a different culture, not only for the sake of fairness, which I think is important in its own right, but also for the sake of institutional continuity. Just like I would tell, and I have told prep schools all around this country that have been overwhelmingly white, for a very long time, that they're going to have to think very seriously about how long they want to exist. If you're going to be a boarding school and you've been around for 100 years, living off the presence of affluent white folks in a country where white folks are dwindling as a percentage of the population, you don't have a very good long-term chance of survival. Ultimately, you're going to be culling from a shrinking base. So you've got to think about change, not just for others, but also for yourself. And so in this particular case, I'm glad that there are folks in the tech sector and in Silicon Valley generally who are willing to ask these questions. I only hope that you continue to ask them without fear or recrimination or anxiety that somehow people are going to look at you or others with whom you work as bad people. I'm sure there are such folks. I'm sure we all know some of them. But the reality is that most of us are good folks trying to get it right. Unfortunately, if we don't understand all the various ways that we can get it wrong, because of the cognitive traps into which we fall, because of our upbringing, because of our conditioning, then we can't solve them. The good news being, the research tells us very clearly that if we are willing to confront that, if we are willing to own our own biases and the extent to which we've been conditioned to see certain people as more meritorious than other people, the research says that if we're willing to do that, we actually can check the bias before it becomes discriminatory behavior. So you actually can interrupt the thought before it becomes the deed. And ultimately, that's what's important. I don't know a lot of people of color who are too worried what white folks think about them. It's how white folks treat them. I don't know too many women who are really that worried about what men think about them. It's how they get treated as women, right? So ultimately, if we can interrupt the thought before it becomes the deed, then the harm, the damage of racism, of sexism, of all these isms can be, if not undone, at least interrupted and diminished in terms of its ability to harm others and really to harm the society upon which we all depend. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. I will take any questions that you have in the time that we have left. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yes.
Thanks. So at least in the realm of sexism, I think there has been some basic acknowledgement that we are not, that this is a major problem in the tech industry and in Silicon Valley with kind of the rise of the programmer culture in mainstream media. How do you take from acknowledgement of the existence of this kind of culture and get past the point where right now it seems like it's a preference, like you have a programmer company or one that is less so, and that's it seems right now like it's interpreted as a matter of preference, like, oh, I'd prefer to work here, not like this shit is unacceptable. Right. How do we stop it? How do we move forward from there?
Right. Well, I think it's a good question because obviously we can acknowledge it and not problematize it, and I think that's what we tend to do. We acknowledge certain things, but we don't ultimately problematize them. Like, we will acknowledge that people tell racist jokes or sexist jokes, whether it's in the workplace or in the school or in the neighborhood, and then we will rationalize that or not make a big deal out of that or act like it's not a problem. So clearly, one does not automatically lead to the other. The good news is that if we create, and sometimes the critical mass needed for this, and I don't mean critical mass of women in a male-dominated sector or of people of color in a white-dominated sector, so much as I mean a critical mass of whomever willing to push back. And it might be in a certain unit of a certain company or a certain industry, just a handful of really committed people. It could be, several dozen, it could be hundreds, it might take more than that. It's never, clear, depending on where you are. But what the research finds is, and my own experience confirms, that when you push back and when a handful of people begin to push back against the sort of unspoken norms of a culture and begin to just question them and to problematize and to ask questions, really more so than even make demonstrative statements. Because it's one thing to stand up and say, this shit is unacceptable. And I'm all for that a lot of times. Like, there are times when you just have to say it that way. And then there are other times when the approach, particularly when folks are really dug in on their denial that there's a problem going on, is to ask a series of questions of them, which leaves very little possible conclusion other than this shit is unacceptable. But it's different if I tell you that or if you think of it yourself, right? It's like with my own children. If I want my children to do something, there are two approaches, right? I can either say, like in the morning, if it's time for school, I can say, get upstairs and brush your teeth, we're gonna be late. Now, that works about 60% of the time, maybe a little bit better than flipping a coin, but not much. Right? Or I can come up with a much more inventive approach. I can ask my daughter, usually it's just one of them, the other one is a little bit quicker on the draw with this, but I'll ask, what are you supposed to be doing right now? Right? Now, I know the answer is brushing your damn teeth. Like, that's the point, right? I could have just told you that, and you know it's that. But if I tell you to brush your teeth, there's that part of you that just, whether you're a kid or an adult, somebody tells you to do something, that might be dug in and not doing it and resist it. But if I ask you, and you say, oh, and she will, brushing my teeth, right? And I go, exactly, that's awesome. Good, Then all of a sudden, she thinks she's a genius. She thought up the problem on her own, right? She now came up with the solution on her own. So if I'm trying to get people to really question the culture of an institution with regard to race or gender or class or sexuality, sometimes asking those kind of questions and getting a handful of people who are prepared to step up as allies and ask those questions. And when I say as allies, I mean specifically this requires that, it's not just people of color who are raising this subject in a white-dominated institution. It's not just women who are raising this issue in a male-dominated institution. It means that some of us who are male and some of us who are white, and especially if we're both, and some of us who are straight and some of us are working class background or whatever it is where these issues come into play, we've also got to be prepared to stand up and to challenge. And what's really interesting in the research is that when that happens, you end up discovering a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, that there are lots of other people in the institutional space who also were thinking, this shit is unacceptable, but they didn't want to go first, right? Part of this is not that we're ignorant or we don't understand the problem. Sometimes that's it. But sometimes it's just, I sort of know the problem. I don't want to put my neck out first. I don't want to go first. Nobody wants to go first because there's that chance that you're going to get, your hand slapped or your neck chopped off or whatever. So you sort of hold back and wait. And as soon as someone else does it, as soon as someone else raises the issue, that's when you'll start to see people go, yeah, I was thinking about that. Now they don't feel they're alone, right? And so I think in a sense that's an important piece. And it's also important to put yourself in the middle of the problem when you're discussing it, to say, it's not just that the culture generically is this way, it's that I'm a part of it, and I've imbibed it, and I've taken part in it, and I've contributed to it, and I realize that that's a problem, because just that level of honesty and transparency makes it easier for someone else to be honest and transparent. Otherwise, what it sounds like is, this shit is unacceptable. I'm good, but this shit is unacceptable, right? As opposed to saying, no, actually, yeah, this shit is unacceptable, but I also am part of the stuff that's not okay. And the minute you allow yourself to be part of the problem, then other people are willing to own their piece of it too. Other questions?
So once you will have this shit is unacceptable moment, and then we support people so that you start to have women in the programmer culture or more African Americans going to college, et cetera, how do we support them once they're there?
Well, I think the key to that, is you have to actively continue to work with and collaborate with people. And with as opposed to for. I mean, the thing that is, I was a community organizer for about a year and a half in the mid-90s, and one of the things that I learned just doing that work was if I was going to work with communities that were marginalized, both racially and economically, and really just culturally oppressed and dominated and targeted and oftentimes devastated communities, the only way I was really going to be of any use as a white man who had a college degree, and so in every way, I had all the privileges and advantages that most of the people in that space didn't, because not only were they folks of color, not only were they poor, and usually not with college educations, they were also disproportionately women in public housing, et cetera. The only way that I could really be of any use to them in the long run was to start by listening to what they said they needed. Not asking them in a voyeuristic way, like, how can I help you? Because that gets old. Like, people who are constantly being crapped on really don't need you to say, how can I help you? Because you can help them by not crapping on them first and foremost. And so we just have to be prepared to listen. So I would go into the community and I would listen very carefully to what was being said. Not necessarily to me in response to a direct question, but just what were they talking about? What were the things on their mind? What were the things that they needed to see change in that community? So that when I then got involved in a campaign to do X, Y, or Z, I knew I was following their lead. And the same is true in a corporate setting or in a school setting. If you listen carefully to what folks of color are saying or what women as women are saying, and sometimes that requires just keeping your ears open, other times it might really require, and I think in the best of cases it does, getting to know individuals and creating relationship with them. Because if I do get to know you on a one-on-one level and I can hear your story and you can hear mine and I can share it with you, then I might be able to figure out some way in which I can assist you in navigating a culture which maybe was not set up for you, but which I see as important for you to succeed in. And also there's some reciprocity involved, because even if as a dominant group member, I was in there working with these communities, not for them, but with them, I was still getting something out of it. It wasn't all a one-way street. It wasn't just that I was going in and giving them the technical assistance that they needed to fight for a particular piece of legislation. I wasn't just giving them information, I was also taking something away. What I was taking away was the insight and the wisdom that otherwise usually was totally untapped and unlistened to. And then I could take that out and talk to other people about it in a way that the people in the community sometimes couldn't, because they didn't have the microphone. So if I'm going to work with and mentor folks who are being marginalized on the basis of some identity that, let's say, I don't share, I'm able to listen very carefully and not only then maybe direct my actions in a way that'll really help them, but more importantly, I'm able to then go and talk to other people, maybe of my own identity. Maybe I can go talk to other men and challenge men around sexism after listening to women talk about what it is that they need to see happen in that regard. Or as a white person, I can challenge other white folks, perhaps in a way that people of color also try to challenge white folks, but oftentimes aren't heard. So I can take the wisdom and then amplify that wisdom, giving credit to the wisdom where credit is due, not assuming that it's mine, but saying, hey, this is the stuff that I'm hearing from folks, and I tend to start with the assumption that they know their needs. And so I think we all should start with that assumption. So there are ways of amplifying, ways of listening, ways of subordinating sort of your own assumptions about what people need to what they actually are saying that they need. A lot of times we might assume that people need a particular resource, and that may be the one that this person needs, but it might not be the one this person needs. This person might need this very formal mentoring structure. This other person might just need one individual to whom they can relate on a very personal, not even professional level in order to feel comfortable when they come to work. So you have to learn to listen and create connection with the people whom you're trying to move into the space where maybe they're not normative for the space.
Hi, do you have any like concrete things that somebody could do on any given day to challenge somebody who just refuses to see anything or hear anything?
Well, I mean, there's no silver bullet for that, and obviously the people who are truly dug in and refuse to see things are usually people, they are movable. Most people are not completely immovable, but the odds that you'll be able, by virtue of some really well-placed argument or fact, or even story, to dislodge them when they're that dug in, you might be able to do it, but the amount of time you're going to have to spend to make that happen may very well not be worth the energy that it takes, even if it works. Those are the kind of people that normally sort of have to have their little come to Jesus moments where something happens and the clouds part and they're like, holy shit, I need to change everything I think about the world. You're not likely to give them that. You might be able to if you're really persuasive, but the odds are they're going to have to come to that on their own. So what does that mean? Do we throw up our hands? No. What it means is that fundamentally, you start not with the hardest cases like that. You're trying to build a certain amount of energy, right? You're trying to build a certain inertia towards justice and toward equity. So if you're starting with the people who are not those folks that you're describing, but folks who say all the right stuff, and for the most part, you can assess that they mean it, at least in theory, that they actually want to do right by folks, that they really do want equity and justice, and they know that these things might be problems, but They may not actually be involved in trying to change anything. They know it here. They're not necessarily working on it in an effective way. Then you start to build a certain sense of capacity. Again, it's not just that people don't want to go first, it's that until they see movement, they may not do anything at all. What I learned in public housing projects when I worked there as an organizer was the thing that the people there needed more than anything, more than me, they just needed to know that they could win a couple of things. And if they knew they could win a couple, and I mean really minor stuff, not like major victories, just minor things to give them a sense of their own power and their own capacity, and then they start to do the work on their own, and they start to change the dynamics in the community, even though there are people in much more powerful positions that don't want anything to change. I remember going in very first week that I was an organizer and talking to somebody about, what are you all fighting for? What are you working on? Because I was going to, hit the ground, be really excited and interested in this. And I figured he was going to answer, well, we're fighting to smash white supremacy, because that's why I was there, by God, and we're going to smash economic injustice. Well, I mean, all that stuff is true. That's their long-term goal. But instead of telling me that, he looked at me and he said, we're trying to get a stoplight right there. Right? And I remember going, what? A stoplight at a corner? Like, what's that? I mean, I know what it is, but why is that such an important thing? And he said, well, I mean, a couple reasons. One is like 4 kids have been hit on their bikes because there's no stoplight. So we need a stoplight so kids will not get hit on their bikes because cars will stop. So that's the most obvious answer. He said, secondly, though, it's more important. The reason we're fighting for the stoplight is because we can get it, right? We can get it. We'll win. If we fight hard enough on this, we'll get it. It won't even be that hard. We'll get the stoplight. And yeah, it doesn't change anything about the larger structure, but it gives the community a sense that there's something possible in their actions, that they can in fact fight and occasionally get the outcomes that they want. That's what any group that's subordinated, whether it's economically, racially, religiously, culturally, in terms of gender, sex, sexuality, needs, is to know that it's not a wasted struggle. And the more that they know that, the more they're invested in the sense that they actually have efficacy and they have agency that can be effective, the more that they're going to want to work with others. They're going to be less exhausted, less burned out. They're going to be physically healthier because they know that even though it's not going to happen quickly, it can happen. Therefore, you end up doing an end run around some of these really hard cases. Ultimately, some of them might change, but the thing that will change them most is not anything that you say, not any story that you tell or statistic that you offer or fact that you give them, but simply the example of people on the move trying to change the institution. Because most people who are really dug in like that also tend to be they just tend to be more compliant people. And it's why they don't want to think outside their existing worldview, because they tend to just accede to what they already assume is normative. Well, if you start to create change, right, with or without them, now that becomes normative. And now that person that's very compliant gets on board. It's like, well, and in fact, they'll get on board and say they were down with it all the time, right? Like, oh my God, it's like people will tell you they marched with Dr. King. Oh yeah, shit, I was at every march. Yeah, I was right there next to him. And, this person was like 7 when King was killed, but they have added 20 years to their age just to make you think that they were at some rally. That person or their parents might have been horribly opposed to the civil rights movement. But now, 30, 40, 50 years later, they're like, oh yeah, I was there, Yeah, I was at Woodstock. No, you weren't. No, you weren't there. And so ultimately, you just create this energy, this movement that other people end up feeling, not all of them, but enough of them feel compelled to glom onto, even if it's for the wrong reasons. Their reasons for wanting to jump on that bus may not be the same as other people's, but if they get on the bus ultimately and take that trip to whatever location justice is to be found, then they'll get there. They may get there with a very different purpose and a very different level of intent, but at the end of the day, if they're there, then you've sort of got them. And so I wouldn't beat my head against the wall on the hardest cases first. I'd save that unless you just feel really persuasive and energetic and you got nothing else to do with the 5 hours. But ultimately, I think that for the most part, the thing that gets folks like that is a sense of inevitability, right? That's certainly what got civil rights laws. It wasn't that Lyndon Johnson woke up and said, oh my God, I've been a stone asshole all of my life and didn't even vote for anti-lynching legislation. Oh my God, I'm a terrible person. It's like Nixon didn't wake up and say, we have been bombing and killing millions of Southeast Asians. What the hell is wrong with me? I should stop this. That's not what happened. Ultimately, these individuals felt that they had no other choice. You couldn't have gotten somebody more dug in on race in a lot of ways than someone like Johnson had been early in his career. You couldn't get anybody more dug in on Cold War mentality stuff than Nixon. And yet, when they felt that they had no choice, they ended up making decisions they might not have even wanted to make, but they had to make them. And that's the power of movement activity. That's the power of the inevitable inertia that you can create with your own energy, with or without those individuals. Thank you all so much. I appreciate you being here.